Celebrating their 70-year relationship, China and the DPRK are embracing new efforts to strengthen ties and promote regional peace and stability. With the DPRK hosting the first visit by a top Chinese leader in 14 years, what is the focus of President Xi Jinping's talks with DPRK counterpart Kim Jong Un? What are the implications for Northeast Asia? And amid stalled negotiation between the U.S. and the DPRK, what might be the roadmap for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Well, to talk more about these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in our studio by Professor Zhao Tou, Fellow of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and also Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. We'll also be speaking via satellite to CGTN correspondent Jack Barton in Seoul and Russian defense analyst Pavel Fagenhauer in Moscow. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Qiuyuan, filling in for Young Ray. All right, so this trip is the first by a Chinese leader to visit the DPRK in 14 years. They are celebrating the 70th anniversary of their relationship. That's a long-standing relationship ever since the PRC was founded. But now, given the timing and the context of it, the trade war, the nuclear disarmament talk, and the fact that President Xi is going to meet with Donald Trump next week in Osaka at the G20 summit, Professor Zhao, let me start with you. How significant is this visit?
Well, this is significant because despite very low-level, high-level visits between the two countries prior to 2018 when DPRK was busy testing nuclear weapons and missiles, after they made a decision to focus on economic development, that paved the ground for better mutual relationship. So it requires mutual cooperation between the two countries to resolve the issue of North Korea's nuclear problem, because they need to cooperate to put in place a new peace regime over the Korean Peninsula to achieve denuclearization. And also for China to work closely with DPRK can help DPRK develop its economy and become a more powerful, richer, and more developed nation in the future.
Right, and the two have actually met 4 times already last year. This is their 5th meeting. The fourth meeting previously was all in China. It does seem like Kim really made some effort to go all the way out to pursue diplomacy with China. It sees its relationship with China as a priority, where talks with the United States are now stalled. But how would you, Professor Ray, how would you describe the interactions between the two leaders?
Well, I think if we look a year ago when President Trump and Secretary Pompeo reached out to Chairman Kim and the DPRK regime, I think there was some risk that the DPRK could open up closer relations with the United States, much in the way Myanmar had, and would potentially be a diplomatic risk for China. And from that moment, we've seen these 4 visits of Kim Jong Un to China, and then now reciprocating, as you said, in the first time in 14 years, I think has really cemented the relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing. And with the breakdown of the talks between the United States and the DPRK, I think it leaves the U.S. kind of on the outside looking in and signals China is really the central player. And it always has been the most influential on DPRK, but it really shows that kind of personal bond is going to carry forward, and nothing will happen on the front between the U.S. and DPRK without the approval of Xi Jinping.
All right, let me bring in our correspondent Jack Barton. He is joining us from Seoul via satellite. South Korea is obviously watching this very closely. Good to have you with us, Jack. Now, what is South Korean media? How is the media there covering President Xi's trip to the DPRK? What are they saying?
It's been headline coverage for the past few days, a lot of it pointing to the fact that it could give a little bit of fresh momentum into those long-stalled nuclear talks, but also, again, talking a lot about the fact that the DPRK, China, they're both having their problems with the U.S. under the Trump presidency at the moment. This strengthens the DPRK's bargaining hand, having China more in its corner, but it also strengthens China's hand when it comes to negotiating in the trade war. Both of those things, it has to be said, are seen as quite positive here in South Korea. Of course, in the long term, stability on the peninsula is the priority. No one I've spoken to here really believes the DPRK will give up all of its nuclear weapons, but a process that can bring stability, calm, order, that's a priority. But also, South Korea has been hit very hard by the trade war. China's its biggest market. Most of that's intermediate goods like semiconductors that go into other products, many of them going to the United States. So there are 2 big issues. Both of them at least in the Korean perspective, intertwined here, which is why it's being watched so closely.
And Seoul has recently announced that it will provide 50,000 tons of rice to Pyongyang through the World Food Program. How would you assess the current status of inter-Korean relations?
They made incredible gains last year, the biggest gains we've seen since the cessation of major hostilities back in the early 1950s. Since then, though, it would have to be say this year they've been on hold. It seems Kim Jong Un doesn't see much use for his relationship with Moon Jae-in at the moment, at least in terms of Moon's influence or lack of influence with Donald Trump. And also, everything progressed so far, it sort of got to the point where there had to then be economics moves with the next step, reopening the joint industrial area at Kaesong, perhaps tourism to Mount Kumgang. None of that can happen because of the sanctions. So they haven't gone backwards. Relations are still good. Kim Jong Un's sister delivered a wreath and condolences when the wife of Kim Dae-jung, the architect of the Sunshine Policy, passed away. But, you know, we're not really seeing any big momentum. It's unlikely we're going to either until we see really some real diplomacy start again between Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump.
Right, and President Donald Trump is scheduled to visit Seoul following the G20 summit in Osaka in Japan next week. Do you think that Mr. Trump will prioritize denuclearization over his economic agenda, or the other way around? Where does the South Korean people stand on the different approaches adopted by the U.S. and DPRK on denuclearization? Obviously, they have their different understanding of what denuclearization means.
Yeah, most people here are expecting that Donald Trump is actually going to prioritize trade talks with South Korea. It doesn't get a lot of headline globally, but there's also a lot of trade frictions when it comes to Trump's protectionist policies and South Korea. Moon Jae-in, however, will be pushing hard on the denuclearization issue. There are differences between Washington and Seoul. Seoul would like to push ahead with some concessions even before Pyongyang really makes a move. Like it would like to open the joint industrial area, resume tourism, get going with a big road and rail infrastructure upgrade, really try and build some goodwill. At the same time, it is aware that Pyongyang would like to divide Seoul from Washington, drive a wedge. So at least publicly, you know, in those press conferences, it tries to stay very much on the same page with Washington. So that's what we see in public. It appears to be in the same line privately. That we know there are some pretty big differences there.
Right. Jack Barton joining us from Seoul. Thank you so much. So the country, the DPRK, is really setting out a new strategic line. They are making notable progress on multiple fronts in economic reform. But I've got to ask this, Professor Ray. It's widely suggested that, especially by U.S. analysts, that there's another purpose for this trip taken by President Xi, that China wanted to use this trip as an opportunity to secure some kind of negotiating leverage ahead of his meeting with Trump next week. Do you hold similar views? What do you think?
Well, as was mentioned, I think it would be helpful because it puts China in the position of offering progress on the nuclear talks through improved dialogue on the trade talks. But I think the U.S. will be very adamant about keeping these separate topics. The U.S. never likes to mix the trade talks with a kind of comprehensive settlement. I think and for the Trump team, the trade advisors are a set package, and then the nuclear advisors are a different package. And I don't think they'll be able to really bring those into play. That would seem logical, but I don't think they'll talk in a comprehensive way.
Right, keeping the trade and nuclear talks separate. But leverage or not, when President Xi meets with President Trump, he's going to relay some kind of message from Kim, is he not? What he's going to say about his meeting with Kim when he meets with Trump next week?
I do think this visit can help President Xi's meeting with President Trump. I think China tries to show that China has special influence over DPRK, especially at a time when neither Washington nor Seoul is able to resume talks with DPRK. Chinese special influence could be very important to resume talks. And I think Xi Jinping could also help convey some messages from North Korean leader. So by showing that China can be a constructive player, being really helpful in moving forward the denuclearization talks, I think that can help China-U.S. discussions on trade and other bilateral issues.
So China does have this unique influence on this issue, but Professor Ray, how likely is China going to be able to bridge the dialogue process between Washington and Pyongyang?
Well, I mean, China's the only country positioned that has the influence on Pyongyang, and I believe that everyone wants the denuclearization process to move forward. And so I think President Trump would like that kind of great moment of a third summit that reaches some more tangible agreement. And I think China is the country that could restart that. And in the fact that the opportunity to meet in the G20 summit is coming up, I think this could stimulate, because Trump really wants that opportunity to get kind of a settlement.
Right. And what does Pyongyang want China to do? Because it's suggested that other than economic help, Pyongyang is going to want China to exert its influence at UN to reverse the economic sanction on its country. Is China willing or prepared to do that?
I don't think so, as China has international legal obligation to implement UN Security Council resolutions. So I think North Korea understands there's very little wiggle room for China in terms of the implementation of sanctions. But China can help in terms of conducting more social and people-to-people exchange with North Korea, introducing Chinese experience of nation building and economic development to North Korea, given North Korea is becoming so interested in developing its economy. So there's a lot North Korea can learn from Chinese experience. And also on the nuclear issue, China can help resolve some of the core obstacles facing diplomacy. One of those is how to agree on a roadmap on denuclearization. Recently, Russia and China are working on a bilateral proposal, and I think by introducing this China-Russian proposal to both DPRK and the United States, China can help bridge the gap between the two countries on that key problem.
You mentioned the economic priority now taken by DPRK. Xi's summit delegation actually included economic officials this time around, and it said that China may increase humanitarian aid and perhaps tourism to the DPRK in the future. Can you elaborate on that? How does that work under UN resolutions, UN rules within the sanction, under the international sanction rules?
Sure. The current UN Security Council resolutions against DPRK do not amount to a comprehensive economic embargo against the DPRK. The recent resolutions passed in 2016 and 2017 prohibit important items for North Korea to export or import. But there are still other items or goods that North Korea can trade with other countries. So there is room for trading and economic cooperation. Tourism is one of those areas, and North Korea has other resources like medicine, medicine resources, the traditional medicine resources that both North Korea and China is very good at. So they can export those non-prohibited items to foreign countries.
All right, and President Xi published an article. His article actually was published in DPRK's official newspaper, Rodam Simon, and he wrote that China is willing to draw up a grand plan with the DPRK that would help realize permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. He did not specify the contents, though. Professor Ray, what kind of grand plan do you think that the Chinese leader have in mind, and what would be a good first step?
Well, I think the aspects already mentioned by Professor Zhao. The 20 years that DPRK has resisted the kind of economic reforms that China has made has left it destitute, and now if it's willing to embrace those kind of policies of state-led development and place itself as an export model, I think that will be very valuable. And then China could really provide the kind of security guarantees that leaves DPRK so insecure in the world and so nervous about America's hostility to that regime, in that China has the ability to enter into the dialogue and promote the viability of the DPRK state in facing these kind of collapse because of the humanitarian risks and the isolation that it's faced. The more interaction, I think the fear is the regime would be vulnerable, but we see the very valuable model that China's provided.
And the export model, all the economic development can't happen with economic isolation, with these sanctions in place. So is there any way that Washington can meet the DPRK halfway? Because Kim has said himself that his country has made some efforts to avoid tensions, but he did not see any positive response. I'm quoting his words. Do you think it's possible that, you know,
well, I think as you mentioned, President Moon in South Korea is more in favor of the kind of old sunshine policy of dialogue and interaction and investment. And so that's important because the last two presidents of South Korea have been less favorable to that approach. President Trump offered this kind of approach of helping North Korea become wealthy. And so I think that was the U.S. approach. But I think China has seen, because it's proximate to North Korea, it can do it. The U.S. promised that, but isn't really in a position to initiate that. So I think this is what we've seen the last year, is the American ambition actualized by China in its economic diplomacy.
And the sticking point here, let's talk about it. The U.S. is demanding the DPRK to totally, completely abandon its nuclear weapons until economic sanctions can be lifted, whereas the DPRK is seeking a step-by-step approach, and they have different understanding of what denuclearization means. Does that include the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States to South Korea? How do we find a way out here, out of the stalemate, Professor Zhao?
Actually, I don't think there is a fundamental gap between the DPRK and American position on how to go forward. Recently, I think both countries indicated their interest to consider approach, which is called a comprehensive roadmap, but with step-by-step manner to implement this roadmap. So they need to design a comprehensive grand plan up front, but in terms of implementation, that can be phased process. It can be taken step by step. So there are, you mentioned the issues of resolving North Korea's security concerns, threat perception, American nuclear umbrella to South Korea, Japan, American military forces in this region. Those are harder security issues. Of course, the United States needs to address those issues to reduce North Korean threat perception, but I think those are harder to be achieved for the near term. I think for near term, a more likely result is for both two sides to agree on a comprehensive freeze of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. At Hanoi, North Korea already put a majority of its nuclear facilities on the table for dismantlement. I think North Korea can go one step further by including some additional facilities into that plan and make it a complete freeze. And that will remove one of Americans' major concerns, which is once some sanctions are lifted, the money that North Korea will get could, in theory, be used to fund the North Korean nuclear programs. But once North Korea agrees to conduct a comprehensive freeze, then the sanction relief, the economic benefits as a result, wouldn't be able to use to enlarge the North Korean nuclear arsenal. So I think that can be an opening for some real interim deal between DPRK and the United States, for the United States to start seriously thinking about partial sanction removal.
So Professor Zhao thinks there's an opening. Last time when they meet in Hanoi, the talks break down abruptly without reaching any deal. Is there an opening for a third act?
I don't think so. I think for the Trump administration's view is they've been burned by this, and I think it was a big win for Kim Jong Un to have the photo opportunity with the United States president. And in a way, the process that Professor Zhao just mentioned should have concluded with a meeting of Trump and Kim. But the U.S. gave that meeting from the beginning, and so they kind of lost their leverage. And I think, therefore, from the U.S. perspective, I think North Korea has to go first and do the kind of comprehensive dismantlement that was just described, and then move forward into the summit process again.
Yeah, and we've got to also talk about Russia's role in it, because that's a great regional power. Our analyst is joining us via satellite in Moscow, Mr. Pavel Fagenhauer. Good to see you there, Mr. Fagenhauer. Now, besides Kim's meeting with leaders from China, the U.S., and South Korea, Kim also met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in April. What's your view on Russia's role in the denuclearization process?
Well, Russia is an old Cold War time ally of North Korea. And Russia, of course, is also a very close neighbor, and Russia has a vested interest in finding a good solution, a permanent solution for the Korean nuclear problem. Russia did a lot of effort to insert itself into a more meaningful role in the Korean Peninsula negotiations. Not that it fully failed. Russia has been part of them, though most likely in the last several years a bit marginalized. Russia right now, its position is that we should want to see a change of kind of less sanctions, more forthcoming to North Korean efforts. But the basic line, of course, is that Russia closely coordinates its policy on North Korea with China, and it's kind of recognized in Moscow that on this part of the Russian-Chinese partnership, China is the more leading partner. And so Russia basically coordinates a position that's very close to the Chinese position, giving China a bit of the initiative. Of course, on other issues, maybe Russia has the initiative.
So you mentioned
so Russia
coordinated.
follows basically Chinese lead.
You mentioned coordinated response, coordinated policy. Let's talk more about that. So Putin has suggested that the DPRK is ready to proceed towards denuclearization, but needs international guarantees of its security and sovereignty instead of just U.S. pledges. How do you read into that suggestion of international guarantee? How would you prepare Putin's call for multinational involvement with Trump's one-on-one dialogue strategy?
Well, Donald Trump, most likely in his retail business, never had really any much experience of multi-party, kind of complicated seeking out compromises. That doesn't have experience in that, and since he doesn't have any political background at all, he doesn't really understand how that works. So it's not maybe that he doesn't like it, he simply doesn't understand it. But in international complicated issues like the Korean one, there's no actually way, just two-way negotiations. It doesn't work like that. It won't work like that. The Korean issue is an international issue involving a lot of nations. Maybe the United States is, of course, a very important one, but China is too, and Russia is too, and Japan, and South Korea. So only a comprehensive international agreement with international guarantees has any hope of achieving anything. And of course, Moscow has been also, together with Beijing, advocating that good North Korean behavior must be rewarded with some, at least, maybe even symbolic, but at least some sanctions relief. But most likely right now, Donald Trump has too many other eggs to boil, and in Osaka, most likely he won't be actually concentrating on North Korea as the main issue.
Professor Ray, I'd like to hear your thoughts of what's being said, the Russian perspective.
Well, I think President Trump wants a deal, and I think he's not somebody who wants a long-term negotiated plan that brings North Korea into a dialogue. He wants a final deal that's done that he can present to the American people before the election, and that's not going to happen. And I think already they're, as mentioned, pivoting toward Iran and losing interest sort of in the DPRK, because Trump doesn't have that background of long-term strategic thinking that's going to pass off to another administration. So I think the moment was the last summit in Vietnam. It failed, and I think that's probably likely the end for America's deep involvement in trying to get to the goal of denuclearization. The process will continue, and the foreign policy establishment will continue, but I think Trump's probably not going to have the same interest as he's had for the last year.
Do you agree with what's being said, Professor Zhao?
Well, with due respect, I'm not so sure. The American one-to-one approach is because of lack of multilateral experience on the American side. I think everyone basically agrees that the first step of resolving the core issue of denuclearization, it really requires the two main players, DPRK and United States, to resolve their key disagreements. And after that is achieved, then the issues will move on to include such as how to design a new regional peace regime. That requires help, support, participation from broader participants in this region. So China, Russia, South Korea, Japan should all contribute. I don't think there is any disagreements. The issue is how others can help DPRK in the United States resolve the core issue of denuclearization first, before we can look at broader issues of peace regime, etc.
And the president of China actually said that he suggested that the DPRK deserves some kind of easing of crippling sanctions. He says that the country is moving in correct direction. So he does feel like Pyongyang should be given some kind of incentives to stay on the right track.
Yes. North Korea recently at Hanoi made a big step forward, which is put entire Yongbyon complex on the table for dismantlement. That's something really important compared to what North Korea was willing to offer before. The U.S. I think was thinking about some reward, but was reluctant to go ahead because they really feared this gap created by sanction relaxation could help fund North Korea's nuclear weapon program. So as I said, if North Korea can go one step further by impose a complete freeze on its nuclear missile program, that would really make North Korea more interested and serious in thinking about sanction relief and create a new opening for discussions.
Right. And final remarks, as President Xi concludes his visit to Pyongyang, how would you evaluate the two countries' long-standing bilateral relationship and its implication to the entire region, the security situation in Northeast Asia, Professor Ray?
Well, with the end of the Cold War, there was the kind of fading away of that core relationship, and then with the change of leadership and with Kim Jong-il didn't have the personal rapport that his father Kim Il-sung had with the founders of China. And so I think these kind of personal meetings 5 times basically in 12 months really rehabilitates what had largely been lost as the personal diplomacy, because strategically North Korea needs China and they are largely aligned on key issues. But I think that you could see in the meeting that Kim Jong Un was thrilled to have this visit and went to, spared no expense in highlighting this, signature moment of a world-renowned leader, Xi Jinping, visiting.
And Professor Zhao?
Well, I think we are looking at a very complex, interesting regional security landscape. There is rising China-U.S. competition, and for North Korea, it needs to balance between the two big powers in order to create the largest breathing room for itself. So it really requires good diplomatic skills to push forward denuclearization and also to maintain strategic stability among the big powers.
All right. Thank you for your insights. And also thank you for Mr. Pavel Falkenhauer joining us from Moscow. Appreciate your analysis, Professor Zhao and Professor Ray. And that does it for this edition of Dialogue here on CGTN. On behalf of the whole team here, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.